The year 1012 saw the erection of the Notre Dame Cathedral, and with that cathedral, you have this new school that begins at the Sorbonne, the university in Paris, and continues through the erection of the cathedral. And two very important characters. One was Leonin, and the other one was Peloton. Looking at the music that they developed, it is very, very interesting to see where we came from. Here you have the origins of notation. Now, earlier in the semester, you saw how Guido of Arezzo published in his book, Necrologos, how to teach notation. So we actually noticed how we went from basically squiggles on the page to actual notes. Well, what did those notes look like? They do not look, for those of you who read music, like the notation that we have nowadays. They pretty much look like this very interesting points, very similar to what neumes were. In fact, we still call them neumes, but each one of them has an association of several groups of notes. Now, here are some, and here are others. I mean, by no means these are all of them. But you're going to notice, for example, here you have the porrectus, and it is notated like this. Here you have it written out. By the way, this is the research of Richard Flowers, Dr. Richard Flowers in New York. And here you have the interpretation, right? So you have C, A, B. So all those three notes are considered within this grouping. Not only that, during the time of Peloton, there was a development. This development were the rhythmic modes. Now, rhythmic modes were also taking into account the pitches. So here you actually have the typical order, or the order of notes, how this rhythmic mode was presented, and here is interpreted. Those brackets on top, they're called ligatures, and they actually tell you which notes belong in groupings together. Notice that there are 6 modes. Those 6 modes came actually from a poem, an Arabic poem. During the time in which this was being created, we're looking at the 13th century, scholars were being brought from the Middle East to actually teach mathematics and different positions, different rhythms that could be brought into the music. Another thing that I want to talk to you about is the 3 techniques. Originally, those 3 techniques were developed by Leonin, the first teacher of the Notre Dame school. Now, Leonin went ahead and came up with what we call parallel motion organum. In parallel motion, what you actually notice is the original voice of the chant, right? Eventually, those chants were turned into clausulas, kind of like a musical parenthesis, an important part of the speech. And then you add other voices. Well, this was messy, and then eventually we came up with organum, which at a particular interval, usually 4th or 5th, one of the perfect intervals, which are 4th, 5th, and octave, and the unison, of course. You have an interval here with a note that is going to follow the original chant, right? So if you're following in a parallel motion that original chant, you are doing parallel organum. Now here is this chant in original ordum and in standard notation over here, right? The very same chant. Here we have a little bit of help, and you will notice that not everything moves in parallel motion. Here you have parallel motion. But if you notice, this note is moving up. This note, however, is moving down. The reason for that is you want to avoid to have this ugly, well, for them ugly, for us pretty normal intervals that were associated with Satan or anti-Christian beliefs. So although you have parallel motion, it is very difficult to just stay with parallel motion. This is just a technique. The 3 techniques were contrary motion, parallel motion, and oblique motion. Oblique motion was quite essential and quite necessary when you needed to have a voice move. Now, I'm going to actually go over here, and you'll notice that this is an actual excerpt from music. And we're going to try to find some oblique motion, right? Basically, one voice stays the same where another voice kind of moves. And you actually here have some obliqueness, right? You notice that this voice is moving up, contrary motion, but when you get to the apex, before this voice starts moving down, this voice stays on the very same notes, right? Make it a little bit bigger so you can appreciate that. So this voice is all the way up. At first, you had a little bit of an incline of contrary motion, right? But here, you actually notice that this voice reached the top, and this voice stayed there. That's what we call oblique motion. So you cannot always stay within parallel, oblique, or contrary motion. Those are just techniques. So if we actually sum up what we talked about, we have first Leonon, who comes up with the idea of parallel motion, contrary motion, oblique motion. Then we deal with his student, who added so many voices more to the organum that he had to really organize things. And how did he do this? Is by importing rhythmic modes into the chant system. And then he actually had everybody singing in the same rhythms, right? So it's what we call homorhythm. Later on, we're going to talk about isorhythm in the late Middle Ages, or you could even say early Renaissance. Now, isorhythm is something completely different. Homorhythm means everybody is singing at the same time. And in order to do that, you need to have rhythm, and we see the beginning of rhythmic modes. Now, this thing here is called a time signature. Everything was set in threes back then because of the Trinity. But you do not have a constant time signature. You see a clef down here, but you don't see a number there. That gets developed later into the Renaissance. I hope this was helpful.